Hello, my name's Simon Timperley from the International Food Safety and Quality Network. Welcome to edition 115 of the Food Safety Fridays webinar program. Today, we'll be speaking with Tom Gosselin from DNVGL Business Assurance. And the subject is sustainable food production sourcing standards. We'll be meeting Tom shortly, but just a few housekeeping things first. Yeah, you're already using it. Some of you typing in the chat bar. Say hello, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you're calling in from today, joining us from. Let us know who you are and where you're calling in from. It is being recorded today, so don't worry if you miss a bit or have an outage or something. We will follow up afterwards with an email with the slides, the recording and the certificate of attendance. Yes, so hello and welcome everybody. Just to say, the Food Safety Fridays webinar program is sponsored. Help to bring these short, brief educations to you each week. And the sponsors are DNVGL Business Assurance, Trace Analytics, AIB International, Metal of Toledo, and Safe Food 360. So thanks to those kind organizations. One other thing, we've done 115 webinars, Food Safety Fridays webinars. So what we did, we've collated them all into an they are all on the website, but we've put them in a handy Excel web document for you, so that you can have that on your desktop and you can, or as a shortcut, and you can access them anytime you want, and it will be continually updated. So ideally access it from the link. Okay, apart from that, now we'll meet Tom Gosselin. You there, Tom?
Hey,
good
Simon.
morning. Morning, Tom. How are you?
Good morning to you as well. I'm great. How are you?
Super. And where are you calling from today, Tom?
I'm from Atlanta, Georgia, and I noticed a couple of people at least indicated they're from Atlanta as well online. So, hey, everyone.
Very good. Everybody's welcome. So, and what's the weather like there at the moment, Tom?
It's kind of warming up a little bit, but still rainy. I think we're going to have a few days of sunshine, but yeah, cooler weather, spring weather.
Very good. Okie dokie. Right. If you can get your slides ready, Tom.
Sure.
I'll tell the audience about next week. Next week, ladies and gents, we have, you can see in the sidebar, traceability and serialization applying successes in pharma to food, and that is with Janice Wortham from Metal of Toledo. So click the register now button to register for that, or follow up with one of our emails during the week. Right, I'll be back for the Q&A later. For now, I'll hand you over to Tom.
Okay, thank you so much, Simon. I hope everyone can hear me okay. Wonderful. I think it's looking good. So yeah, thank you, everyone. So happy Friday to everyone. And for those of you over in Europe and beyond, great weekend, and you're only one webinar away from going down to the pub if you're in the UK. Great. So my presentation today is going to be about sustainable food production and sourcing standards. Kind of a long-winded title. What I'm looking at when I talk about sourcing standards, I'm talking about standards which address sustainability in a product or ingredient going up to the source where it comes from. And when I talk about sustainable food production, that's also looking at the sustainability and the standards that support sustainability that can be applied to the production stages of food production. And I'm using food production, and I'm not talking really about beverage, not necessarily for any reason that I've used kind of to simplify the presentation and to break it down. I've used a food product as an example. So what I've used is a loaf of bread. I thought that was kind of like a product that one could relate to, and it has some interesting ingredients that we could look at from a sustainability perspective. So if we look at a loaf of bread, it basically comes from initially ingredients. They have to be grown somewhere. They are then processed by a baker. Then they go through the retail process to finally get to the consumer, who will then consume that product. Okay, I did say it was simplified, so please no criticisms on that. It's very straightforward in that sense. And what we're going to look at when we're looking at the sort of life cycle of the product, the loaf of bread, and its ingredients, is we look at how basically pressure is applied in reverse of this this process. So typically the consumer is the one that places sustainability demands or has expectations that it places on the retailer, and the retailer in turn will place expectations on the baker, for example, the food processor, producer, to perhaps address sustainability through sustainability standards, even putting criteria on the baker to source products or ingredients that have sustainability certifications going with them. So I hope that illustrates how the pressure or the expectation is passed on up that supply chain, all the way to source sometimes. So we can look at some of the ingredients that are in the bread loaf. We got the wheat. We can have sugar derived from sugarcane and palm oil. I'm looking at these ingredients as well as soy here as potential ingredients, and I'm not saying all bread products have soy or have palm oil or palm oil derivatives. Typically wheat and sugar are present in some form or other. If it's not sugar, it's a sugar substitute, corn derived, for example. But from a consumer perspective, ultimately, they may become aware of sustainability impacts that are derived from the sourcing of some of these ingredients. And some of these may be, during this presentation, may ring true to you. You may have heard of some of these issues. So looking still up that stream where we're looking at the ingredients going into the final product, as I mentioned, there are expectations sometimes which are implicit. That means the consumer doesn't really know that it's an issue until it can become an issue. And other times the consumer is very much aware of the issue behind that product. In fact, that product may be best known for some of the worst impacts it has. So looking at sugar, for example, sugar is, from the sustainability impact, just from the environmental side, it's there's a big issue around water intensity and quality within the sugar industry. There are biodiversity impacts that can be derived when you have just pure sugarcane plantations. You can have impacts on biodiversity, either directly from that crop displacing another crop, and also from crop protection methods that impact biodiversity otherwise. Then also there's societal concerns about these crops being used for fuel rather than for food, and therefore having an economic impact on the price of the use for food. Also, studies have shown, and several NGOs highlight the concerns around slave labor when it comes to sugarcane plantations. These are not exactly prevalent, but some of the worst cases do get highlighted. For example, we talked about that slave labor problem. This is news articles that came out from Brazil back in 2009. And they're saying that of all the crops in Brazil, sugarcane production is the one that most uses slave labor, based on their studies. So these are kind of well known within development circles, and each industry has been documented for its exposure to slave labor. You can see here from this study that actually cattle farming is the industry in Brazil that had the biggest impact, but sugarcane is also there. You can see it's only 1%, but it's known because that's where a lot of sugarcane comes from. And yeah, this becomes an impact then later on, the company being accused of having it within the supply chain, then having an impact from its finances. So the Brazilian National Development Fund pulled its loans as a result of these charges that happened in this case. And as a result, the effect is that Walmart then clearly blacklists that sugar company. Also with sugar, there's land diversion and biodiversity impacts. And I'm not going to go into great detail, but this is also another study looked at the forest and the clearance that happened as a result of sugar industry. Sometimes it's difficult to determine exactly which industry is driving that deforestation. It's a combination of sugar, cattle, and otherwise clear cutting and getting communities getting access into these areas, and population increases. So it's not always clear it's purely sugar, but it's kind of well known and highlighted by a lot of NGOs. This also leads to brands like Coca-Cola, and then Coca-Cola then adopts and requests in the supply chain that they also always get audited or evaluated for their management of land rights. So land rights is something that it is within the Coca-Cola Code of Conduct, and it is audited. All suppliers are audited to that standard. So ultimately, the intent is to make sure that no sugar is ultimately derived from plantations that are involved in land grabs and displacement of local populations. So when we talk about these issues that are highlighted, I also want to highlight it for each of these ingredients that we're talking about and we're describing, how standards are developed. And using the example of sugar, there's a standard called Bon Sucro. As its name implies, it's largely focused in Brazil. It's as with any credible stakeholder, it has to have a stakeholder-driven standard. It has participation from companies like Cosan and large sugar producers, as well as NGOs, indigenous rights groups, environmentalists, and so on. A standard setters, national standard setters will typically participate and oversee the process to make sure it's credible. But the Bon Sucro standard has these 5 principles, and any company that wishes to certify its end sugar product to Bon Sucro standard has to go through this audit at both a corporate level, and then the individual sugar plantations are sampled for compliance to this standard. So that's an example of a sugar-based standard. And it's kind of early on still with Bon Sucro, but these are not too recent numbers, but to give the status, it is a growing standard, but it is largely focused on Brazilian producers so far. So seeing how the traction goes. The next product people may have heard about this a little bit more. Palm oil. At least I look at my Facebook feed, and usually someone is raising the issue of palm oil amongst my friends and is concerned about palm oil within their products. And like before with sugar, there are similar issues around that, but it's kind of unique and localized again. So deforestation is an issue. Also because, and I said localized, most of the production is between Indonesia, Malaysia, that area, some in South America. But particularly in Indonesia, it's the perception and quite alarming images that people see are the ones where they impact directly on orangutans, largely as a result of deforestation. So deforestation happens because in order to create agricultural land for cultivation, and then you get the impact there of displacement of wildlife. There's also community displacement as well. Again, the issue around land rights and sometimes where there are informal land rights structures, and people may not necessarily have, paperwork to support land claims. They can be impacted and easily displaced, not helped by local corruption and so on. Unfortunately, and there have been some cases of poor labor conditions as well. This is no criticism of what happens necessarily in any single country, but these issues tend to happen with any crops. It's just unfortunate that our demand as consumers and as the largest consumers are typically the ones who are driving these plantations to increase and have some impact on the ground unless some sourcing measures are taken. So in addition, palm oil is also, a biofuel. So that's led to a rapid rise in deforestation impacts. 85% is grown in Indonesia, Malaysia, and Papua New Guinea, as I mentioned. And just to illustrate it, in 2005, there were 60,000 orangutans born in Sumatra, and today there are actually less than 40,000, I believe. Here's just an example of the degree of deforestation that's impacted from 1950 to 2020. So this is one, of course, that's quite alarming, and impact not just on local biodiversity, but also our capacity to absorb carbon dioxide. This is also another way to illustrate that rate. Mentioned about community displacement. In fact, there's a kind of indicator of where it happens the most. It does happen everywhere, but actually the biggest impact apparently happened in China. I wasn't even aware that there was that much production of palm oil in China, but even though I think it believes has a lower market share, apparently according to this study, it has more impacts on displacement. And in fact, the Malaysian, Indonesia, and Papua New Guinea, perhaps because increased certification and oversight, don't have as much impact. This one quite surprising when I was putting together this presentation. So as a response, as I mentioned before, Bonsucro, a bunch of smart people, from representing industry and NGOs and supranational organizations, UN bodies and so on, got together to develop the Roundtable for Sustainable Palm Oil certification standard. And kind of like with Bonsucro, it's very mostly localized, dealing with one area, but it has had more, been around for longer, so it's probably having a larger impact within the market, and you get more traction of it. I rarely see in my professional life a demand or request for Bon Sucre certification, but responsible palm oil certification is definitely something that's more in demand, and is increasing the certification in North America, for example. And as I mentioned, it's Indonesia's largest producer of palm oil, and also the second largest producer of certified palm oil as a result. And 9% may seem small, but for a fairly new standard, that is in effect quite an achievement. So I encourage you to take a look at their website and find out more about RSPO certification if you have any interest. The certification is increasing. The latest numbers I seem to have is from 2015. I think the peaking there was a justification due to the transition to some green certificates. That wasn't necessarily a drop off. It was just the way they were accounting for it. And finally, to conclude on these sourcing standards, let's break away from palm oil, having looked at the sugar one before, and also one that again looks and has a fairly local dimension because of where the crop comes from. It's soy. Again, a bunch of sort of credible people got together, developed a standard, and the following companies kind of adopted that as a standard to use going forward. So these are the companies: DuPont, Dow, Bunge, ADM, and Colgate-Palmolive. Conservation International was the chief NGO behind it, and the IFC also intend to use that as a sort of investment decision when considering loans for any kind of projects that may have impact through soy agricultural practices. WWF, I've embedded some videos, but I fear Simon is going to get very concerned if I play any of them, just in case I overload the system. But I do encourage you to look at, Google some things like Roundtable for Responsible Soy and WWF to get some insight on what's happening within that. And there really are quite good videos. Also, retailers have come up with positions on palm oil. And basically they're passing that on. And as we remember from one of the earlier slides, we have that kind of chain that happens, that pressure that happens from the consumer. And they want to have products with responsible palm oil certification. So in turn, Walmart, Kroger, Costco, and Target, as examples, will start putting sort of requests out there and passing those requests onto their suppliers. And that's kind of where the certification will happen. Walmart itself or Kroger itself will not get themselves certified or anything. It'll be them asking their suppliers, starting perhaps with their own branded products, but also for top shelf products from the branded products that are on the shelves in those retailers. So we've talked about the sourcing. We've talked about these ingredients and how the demand is driven, what the issues are, and what standards have been developed to kind of pass down the supply chain from consumers to retailers and so on. And we talked about mostly that sort of field aspect, where the agriculture has come from, where the commodities have come from. So there's another part of the supply chain that also is considered, and that's that baker picture, if you recall. It's the part where the actual production happens. So we're going to talk a little bit about that part. That's what I call the supply chain rather than the sourcing of certified agricultural commodities. So it's this next part. It's when you get sort of either some sort of refining activities you look at. It could be processing facilities. Generally, we look at the supply chain and we look at chokeholds or where there can be blending of products, because we really want to understand, where perhaps a certified commodity can go through and form part of a mass balance. We have to look at the processing part. And then we look at that bakery part as well. So it's where's it doing its final production and packaging. So basically, different from sustainable sourcing, these supply chains cover everything beyond the farm and even up to the consumer. You can even say the retailer itself is part of that supply chain to the consumer in one way. So they become part of the pressure points anyway of how, who demands what, and definitely the retailer at least is the one that secures the supply chain. So here's my part about who exactly, again, who's asking about what from manufacturing facilities, at least in North America. And I do apologize that my presentation is maybe North American centric, but this is the market I'm more familiar with. But in North America, there are retailers, large ones, that are placing requests directly on the companies that are doing that final production and packaging. And examples of these are Kroger, Target, Costco, and Walmart. And I think everyone will see that even just looking at Walmart, that this represents, just this sample represents a significant amount of the retail force in North America. There are a few others that of course do this, but I just want to highlight these because I couldn't include all of them. Otherwise, it'll be a very busy slide. But essentially, each one of these have a supplier code of conduct. So they will have expectations on mostly around working conditions. Excuse me, have some water. Mostly around working conditions, some environmental, but working conditions and health and safety. So this perspective on the more immediate supply chain, on their suppliers, is looking at more working conditions rather than societal or environmental impacts. They still usually include an environmental part, but it's mostly focused on working conditions, ensuring that their suppliers meet minimum, usually ILO benchmarked standards. And these are what we call, supply chain social audits, supply chain compliance audits, and other such audits. But these are the specific ones that have been developed by these retailers. As I mentioned, they come from originally from ILO codes, or International Labor Organization codes, and will cover issues such as child labor, forced labor, freedom of association rights, and payment rights, and so on. Looking at, working hours aren't too excessive. And again, this is ultimately because consumers, don't want to kind of hear that their bread is being produced by ultimately slave labor going far up its supply chain, such in the case of, as we saw in the case of sugar in Brazil. Even though it's not very prevalent, even one case can drive a big perception. So it's also about making sure these basic labor rights are respected through the supply chain and immediately up to the top level producers and packagers. Why do retailers do this? As I mentioned, they have a reputation to uphold. We often have cases, let's use some examples in a second. There's a legal liability, quality and food safety concerns as well that usually go hand in hand. These requests, and it's also about doing the right thing. I'm not too cynical to believe that no one wants to drive poor practices, but in some industries and some ingredient supply chains, you also get that human rights impact that happens. And there's so many books and documentaries nowadays about the sourcing of these foods and about food chains that sort of societal shift and expectation from society and consumers drives a lot of this as well. So our increasing consideration of it drives the retailers to develop these codes and say, we don't want to have it in the supply chain. And then they kind of step up to the plate and commit to having monitoring of that supply chain, which is what companies like DNVGL do through existing standards. So pardon the jump into the slides so quickly. I want to transition a little bit more into also some of things that are being driven through the supply chain from the large retailers to the immediate suppliers, which are some of the environmental initiatives. Walmart, Costco, Whole Foods, some of these companies now have actual carbon reduction targets even for their supply chain, and the same issue happens with food waste. Food waste is recognized by retailers as being something that can be tackled in the immediate production area, in this case the bakery for our bread. So it's shocking some of the questions and the statistics around food waste, and that emerging issue is now being pushed from those retailers down to that production. And as I say, and I repeat myself again, it's necessarily the ones doing their own brands that they want to, of course, address quickest because they have most control over those. So, just also to give perspective, I know North America the most, and I think our statistics are quite horrendous in how much food waste is produced in North America. So this is something that's perceived and known as an issue, and it's one of the emerging issues. Like you also now see, of course, plastic pressures on everyone, but the public out there is aware of this issue, and this issue was top of mind about 4 years ago. Plastic is possibly overtaken it as an issue. So within the last 2 years, so it's interesting the dynamics and how quickly these issues get to the top. I mentioned before the food waste also has an impact on energy, and the two are totally interconnected. So this is also something that kind of retailers are, surprisingly have their eye on and will be working with in the future with select suppliers to target some of these issues where they can have the biggest impact. So yeah, expect these issues to come top of mind finally. I want to conclude now because we've talked about all these standards and certification standards and their perception of how they how you communicate those standards to consumers at the end, especially when you can have a product that could potentially have a bunch of certifications, or logos on them. And I'm sure all of us have seen a highly sustainable product that has all these sort of no GMO or gluten-free and fair trade, and all these labels on them to indicate how sustainable a product is. And how do you communicate that to a consumer more meaningfully, without sort of overcrowding your product, and also being able to tell the story of all those certifications in a more interactive and engaging way with the consumers. So basically, one way, how do you reflect the multiple value of certification standards potentially you can have in a product? So we worked with some brands in the Italian wine industry to do this prototype of and develop these labels that have a QR code that a consumer can use and be able to look at the backstory of that product, in this case wine, and see all the certificates that's attached with it, and see that there's a verification of some of the environmental claims, for example, that product has, as well as its quality. So it's knowing the fact that it is the right varietal grape assessed in the bottle from the right region. So as a last exercise, and before I kind of go to Q&A, if anyone has a smartphone, this one actually works, okay? If anyone, I've tried it out several times. I encourage everyone to use a smartphone with a camera and put it up to the screen now. This is audience participation live. Don't get too excited, folks. But for those of you who can, I encourage you to just scan get your camera, focus on that QR code. Hopefully it should open up like automatically a browser, a Safari browser if you have an iPhone or browser. Just click on that and you can look at a lot of details about the origin of this bottle of wine, in this case a rosé, an Italian rosé. So I've never done this before. Technically this could go pear-shaped, but I'm going to leave it on the screen for a little while so you can have it on there. But I just wanted to conclude by saying, we have a deep understanding, because we work in this space, about all these standards and certifications out there. They are numerous, they're increasing, and they're kind of exciting and to us at least, because we're geeky about that. But ultimately, it's becoming harder and harder to tell a singular story, because otherwise people have to understand what the different certifications mean. A lot of companies are trying to avoid any more labeling. Period. You want to preserve and keep the simplicity of your brand. It's easier to manage that through something that can give an insight into existing certifications, recognize those, and provide a fuller story. So with that being said, and I hope some of you managed to use that, and if not, maybe Simon can figure out some way of sharing it around so you can try it later on. But it's kind of a fun thing. You can check exactly, which farm it came from and the origin of the grapes. And it tells a nice story. So I hope some of you managed to do so. Simon, with that being said, I look forward to answering some of these questions from these fine people.
Yeah, if you can, thanks for that, Tom. If you can switch your webcam on and then stop sharing, and then we'll come on. Yeah, thanks very much. Very thought-provoking. There was lots of, I don't know if you saw actually in the sidebar throughout your presentation, lots of discussion between the attendees.
I did not pay any attention, to be
No,
honest. It would have distracted me. Excuse me.
they're not questions as such, but they're sort of saying, in some ways, where do you start? So many certifications, and what do you ask suppliers, etc., and things like that. And
Okay.
in terms of the QR code, unfortunately, it didn't work for me. I have got a Samsung S8. It didn't work, but it did work for some people. They definitely said that it did. Whether it was people with Apple phones that did work, I don't know. But fundamentally, the concept of it is superb. Because you tend to get there are that many demands for legislation to be on labels. In terms there's that much on it, it's overload, and it actually renders it useless in the end. There's that much information. So to actually have something simple that you can scan and get then access to a vast amount of information is really great. So how many products do we see that sort of technology on now?
We've got a trial in a couple of things. I'm trying to, the other ones, I think, a bit more industrial applications. But this is the one that resonates the most. And you can go online and look up DMVGL My Story, and they have several different cases, but this is the one that, of course, resonates with people, because who hasn't sat there at the dinner table and kind of go, okay, this was produced by a great farm on the west, left bank of the Rhone. Everyone wants to tell that story at the dinner table and have a little bit of provenance. So it's a high-end product, but it can tell a good story.
Excellent. Yeah.
It avoids any sort of like multiple labels on things.
Yeah, definitely. Great. Right. Any questions then for Tom? Okay. Ricky is, let's see, organic. This is Ricky Con. Organic doesn't equal sustainable. An organic production can still use slavery or have poor labor conditions. We already have organic certifications. We need sustainability certifications or evidence, which is totally different.
No, it's true. Organic in itself doesn't guarantee full sustainability. Sustainability has to consider, the three overlapping circles of economy, society, and the environment. So you can't just look at organic in isolation. It's possibly more pragmatic to have organic certifications alone in countries where, or places where working conditions are monitored quite carefully already. But yeah, same with fair trade. You could say that includes some bits, but not others. So pure sustainability standards, it's always trying to figure out which is the best one and that's why you get particular ones for different industries and commodities.
Okay.
Thank you for that, Ricky.
Noah has made a comment. Hi, I'm watching from Papua New Guinea. Just wondering if palm oil from my country can be traced back to my country and not Indonesia or Malaysia.
Yes, of course. It's most shipments and export will make sure that your product is traceable back to Papua New Guinea, regardless. The thing with we're talking about certification of products. So with something like palm oil, there are requirements on, either putting it into the supply chain via blended method, or you preserve the identity, you keep it in product bags. But yes, the RSPO standard, for example, will allow it to be traced back and say exactly where it comes from.
Okay, Brandon Holder, are there any efforts to harmonize sustainability standards or better define sustainability?
Yeah, permanently. It's always trying to be kind of the holy grail is to go up and ultimately people want an ISO standard as being an international one, and that's the way everyone strives for. But there's with any emerging issues, you get that battle of the standards a little bit. You can get competing standards that completely compete over this and overlap over the same space. So that could confuse things as well. But yes, there's always efforts to try to harmonize it, and hopefully it will happen at some point.
Okay, Natalie Bonilla, is it required by FSMA or FDA to request sustainability certification?
Certainly not to my awareness. I'm not too familiar with FSMA or FDA. There will be some issues that overlap, I'm pretty certain, but I'm not in the details of those standards or those regulatory requirements.
Okay. And Leslie, Tom, really excellent presentation. Do you believe consumer behavior is sufficient to drive the change with everybody to be who are so concerned about price?
I mentioned sometimes that it becomes an expectation, and no one sometimes the consumer doesn't proactively raise this an issue. But when something pops up, and like the issue of slave labor in the shrimp supply chain, and that Costco got so wrapped up in, of course, consumers don't want it to happen. So companies are prepared to respond to that. The retailers are prepared to respond to that largely. And they are proactive, and they pretty much, these sourcing departments, supply chain departments, have their eye on the ball all the time. What's the next issue coming around the corner? And the NGOs typically speak with them and raise an issue before it kind of becomes aware and is known to the public. So there's kind of a process to it.
Okay. Steve Brown, is DNA technology advanced enough to indicate geographical sources?
I'm not that familiar with DNA technology. The example we used of the wine bottle is based on blockchain, which is linked to GIS. So that's how we ensure the supply chain. We can verify that. We consider that to be intact, and it allows us to say, okay, well, we're certain it comes from this estate, so we will go and do an independent verification on that estate. If it comes from several estates and it's a blended wine, we then can check the samples of that. So we use, I said, blockchain and GIS to be able to locate points in the supply chain rather than DNA technology. But it's kind of the quality part of the wine industry that deals with perhaps, terroir and the quality in that sense. I'm not sure whether they're using DNA or not. At least perhaps for the varietal to look at, is the right varietal, but that's about to the extent that they used in that for the supply chain.
Okay, Amy just did make a comment. I think not so much DNA, but stable isotope testing can be used as an indicator of origin. Yes,
and I've seen this application in the mining industry as well. But yeah, that's definitely I've heard of that application. I'm not so familiar with isotope testing.
Okay. Brandon, just give you a bit of feedback. Wonderful presentation, and I greatly appreciate your effort to condense so there's lots of time for Q&A. Right, and then a question from Brandon. You bring up blockchain. There's a lot of argument from IT people as to whether this technology makes good sense to use in our industry. Have you found others adopting this other than just the wine industry?
Oh, blockchain for sure. It was Walmart and collaborating with IBM, I believe, and blockchain for its leafy greens sourcing. I think that's a pilot project to be extended elsewhere. There are multiple other blockchain applications we've worked. Our own certificates are all blockchain linked. We worked in the electric vehicle market as well with blockchain. We work on energy and blockchain. I'd say this is the one that's more consumer facing. Typically, it would, as was mentioned, industrial applications that happen backstage and looking at the supply chain. But the great thing about this one is it really is just gets straight to everyone, and it summarizes our work and makes it look a little bit more, less dry than it can be sometimes. So it's a nice way to present it in a consumer-friendly way.
Okay, and Rokshanara, what are the certification agencies certifying sustainability?
Which certification agencies certify sustainability?
Yeah.
I think, each one probably will do to some degree, depending on what standards they are. They're certifying too. Of course, ISO 14001 and quality and health and safety certifications are partially sustainability certifications. But, it depends, as I've illustrated, there's so many standards out there that not all certification bodies can certify to all of them. Some may specialize in food and beverage like we do, and some may focus also on electronic supply chains, which we also work in. Others may look at the garment industry. So we tend to specialize, and that's largely driven by where we're located and what supply chains are there.
Okay. Question from Bawani. I'm not sure whether you'll be able to help. Standard for sourcing of spices and herbs from India?
Yes, I did. I worked on this a few years ago. I can't remember. There's like a responsible mint one. It's sometimes quite niche. The tea industry has its standard. The coffee industry has a standard. There's a mint standard that was being developed a few years ago. I worked on chili to look at that. I don't believe there was a chili standard. But there's a responsible spice initiative. You should look at it, I believe. So I haven't looked at it for a while, but you inspired me to do that.
Elizabeth, in terms of sustainable soy, is the round table of responsible soy used by farmers in the United States? From my research, I have seen the use of the US soybean sustainability assurance protocol used rather than RTRS. Great presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I'm not, up to date of the uptake of RTRS in North America or even the world. I haven't kind of have a deep dive into it for a while. But this often happens. You get alternate standards. Sometimes they could be more industry driven. Others are perceived to be more NGO driven, or to some, the consumer may prefer one to the other. We've seen that in the paper industry. It happens. So it can be that the RTRS was rather focused on certain issues that were prevalent in Brazil and were not addressed elsewhere.
Okay, just another one. Patricia saying, thank you for an eye-opening presentation on sustainability. There's been a few calls for a specific webinar for us to do a webinar on blockchain. Yeah. So any further questions while we've got Tom? We've got a few minutes left if anybody does have a question. Okay. Yes, you do, Amy. Go on then. Oh, right. Okay. Blockchain webinar. Right. Yeah. Okay. I think we've done it. Tom, thanks very much.
Thank you.
It was enjoyable, enlightening, educational, and it's all recorded, and we'll see. They'll be able to re-watch this. Brandon has just come in with a last. He's just got you before you go in. Are you seeing most of the innovation in sustainability being driven by customers or by industry or both?
I think the innovation is definitely being driven by industry. There's some great stuff going on behind the scenes to make sure that when a company says they're doing something, it really, is demonstrable. So that sort of increasing quest for absolute certainty is making sure that it's driving the technology. The customer doesn't care as long as it's credible, and it's industry that in some cases, not all the cases, really are being very forward thinking and trying to stay just one step ahead of the issues and one step closer to certainty. Very
good. Okay. Right. Thanks very much, Tom. Really appreciate your time today, and hope to have you on another webinar in the future with us.
Sure.
So, thank you very much. Have a good weekend, Tom.
You too. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye. Okay, that was Tom Gosselin from DNV Geo Business Assurance. Very nice presentation. I'm sure you'll agree. I'll just load the certificate into the sidebar, and you can download that. Don't print it, save paper. Download it, and then you can actually open it in an image editing program like Microsoft Paint and type your name. Yeah, that's it. Thanks for your attendance today. Thanks for being with us. It's Friday, best day of the week. Enjoy the rest of your day and enjoy your weekend, and we'll see you next week.